The wind howled like 1,000 wolves the night Frank Turner's father traded her for 3 sacks of grain and enough medicine to keep his younger children alive through the winter of 1882. She stood in the doorway of their cabin outside Brownsville, Texas, watching the blizzard rage with an intensity that seemed impossible this far south. A freak storm that had already killed livestock and isolated homesteads for days. Her father would not meet her eyes as he shook hands with the supply merchant, a greasy man named Dobbs who smiled through rotted teeth and promised her father the goods would arrive by morning if the trade was made tonight. Frank was 22 years old, and she understood with a clarity that cut deeper than the freezing wind that her life as she knew it had just ended. "Get your things," her father muttered, his voice rough with shame and whiskey. "Quick now." She had nothing to gather, except the threadbare shawl around her shoulders and the small wooden horse her mother had carved before dying of fever 3 years prior. Her younger siblings huddled near the failing fire, their faces thin and pale, coughing with the same rattling sound that had taken 2 neighbors already that month. Frank looked at them, memorizing their features, wondering if she would ever see them again. Her sister Mary, just 8 years old, started to cry, but their father barked at her to hush. Frank walked out into the storm without saying goodbye because she knew if she tried to speak, she would break entirely, and she refused to give Dobbs the satisfaction of seeing her weep. The merchant grabbed her arm with fingers that dug through her thin dress, and she jerked away from him, stumbling into the snow that had already drifted waist-high in places. The cold stole her breath. Dobbs laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound, and pointed toward a covered wagon barely visible through the whiteout conditions. She could see horses stamping and snorting, their breath creating clouds of steam, and a figure sitting rigid in the driver's seat. As they approached, she realized it was not Dobbs who would be taking her, but someone else entirely. "This here's Kade Zimmerman," Dobbs shouted over the wind. "He's the one doing the supply run. You belong to him now, girlie. He paid good money for you, so you best be grateful and do whatever he says." Frank felt her stomach turn to ice that had nothing to do with the temperature. She forced herself to look up at the man on the wagon, expecting to see cruelty or lust, or the blank indifference she had seen in Dobbs's eyes. Instead, she found herself staring at a young man, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by snow and eyes that held something she could not quite name. Surprise, maybe, or anger. He looked from her to Dobbs and back again, his jaw tightening. "What the hell is this?" His voice was low, carrying an edge despite the storm trying to swallow it. "Your payment like we agreed," Dobbs said. "Fresh young thing, healthy, strong enough for work. Better than gold in times like these, Zimmerman. You got your supplies, I got my delivery fee, and you got yourself a woman to boot. Everybody wins." "I paid you in actual money, you piece of filth," Kade said, his knuckles white where he gripped the reins. "I never agreed to take a person as part of any deal." "Well, her daddy was short on cash and I was feeling charitable," Dobbs replied with a shrug. "Take her or leave her, but I got what I needed either way. If you do not want her, I will find another buyer. Plenty of men out here who would pay well for a girl like that, pretty enough even half frozen." Frank watched Kade's face as he processed this, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered to her again with something that might have been guilt or fury or both. The wind gusted so hard it nearly knocked her off her feet, and she swayed, her legs already numb from the cold. She had been outside for less than 5 minutes and could already feel the deadly chill settling into her bones. If she did not get somewhere warm soon, she would not survive the night, and some distant part of her brain wondered if that might be preferable to whatever fate awaited her otherwise. "Get in the wagon," Kade said, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. She hesitated, unsure if this was better or worse than staying with Dobbs, but the merchant gave her a shove that sent her stumbling forward. Kade reached down with one hand, and after a moment she took it, feeling the strength in his grip as he hauled her up onto the seat beside him. His hand was warm even through the glove he wore, and she found herself suddenly fighting tears at that small mercy. He immediately shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, leaving himself in just a wool shirt and vest. "You will freeze," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "I have been in worse," he replied shortly, not looking at her. "Hold on tight." He snapped the reins and the horses lurched into motion, the wagon wheels creaking as they pushed through the deep snow. Frank looked back once and saw Dobbs already disappearing into the storm, probably heading back to whatever hole he had crawled out of. And beyond him, the faint light of her father's cabin growing dimmer. She turned forward and did not look back again. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Frank could barely see 5 feet in front of them. She had no idea how Kade knew where he was going, but he seemed to navigate by instinct, his body tense and focused. She huddled in his coat, which smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something else she could not identify, something clean and masculine that made her feel strangely safe despite everything. Her mind kept circling back to what Dobbs had said, that she belonged to Kade now, that he had paid for her. The words made her feel less than human, like one of the horses pulling the wagon, and shame burned in her chest alongside the fear. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, needing to hear her own voice to remind herself she was still real. "My ranch," Kade said. "About 2 miles north of here. We should make it before the worst of the storm hits." "This is not the worst," Frank asked, looking at the wall of white surrounding them. "No." He glanced at her for the first time since they had started moving, and she saw his expression soften slightly. "You really got traded for supplies." "My father has 4 other children," she heard herself say, defensive despite everything. "They were starving. The medicine Dobbs promised might save them from the sickness that has been going around." "That does not make it right," Kade said flatly. "I know," Frank replied, her voice cracking. "But knowing that does not change anything, does it?" He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, I suppose it does not." The ranch house materialized out of the storm like a miracle, a solid 2-story structure with a barn and several outbuildings clustered around it. Kade drove the wagon straight into the barn, and the sudden absence of wind felt like a blessing. Frank sat shivering while he jumped down and moved to unhitch the horses with practiced efficiency. She watched his movements, trying to understand what kind of man he was, whether she should be terrified or hopeful or simply numb. He worked quickly, getting the horses into stalls with feed and water, then turned back to her. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so." She tried to stand and immediately stumbled, her legs refusing to cooperate after being frozen for so long. Kade caught her before she hit the ground, his arms solid and steady, and without asking permission, he simply picked her up and carried her toward the barn door. "The house is just 30 feet," he said, "but we need to move fast. Can you hold on to me?" Frank wrapped her arms around his neck, too cold and exhausted to protest, and he kicked the door open and plunged back into the storm. True to his word, it took less than a minute before they were pushing through another door into blessed warmth. He set her down carefully near a large stone fireplace where flames crackled and danced, filling the room with heat and light. Frank sank onto the floor in front of it, holding her hands toward the fire, barely able to comprehend that she was no longer in immediate danger of freezing to death. Kade moved around the room lighting lamps, and she took the opportunity to look around. The house was simple but well built, with solid furniture and clean floors, a kitchen area on one side and a seating area around the fireplace. Stairs led up to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything spoke of a man who took care of his possessions and valued order. No woman's touches were evident anywhere, no curtains or decorative items, just functional space kept neat. "You need dry clothes," Kade said, startling her out of her observations. "I do not have anything that will fit you properly, but I can find something warm. Then you need food and rest." "What happens after that?" Frank asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since Dobbs had made his obscene trade. Kade stopped in his tracks and turned to face her, his expression troubled. "I do not know," he admitted. "I never expected to be in this situation. Dobbs told me he could get supplies through the storm for a price, and I paid him because I was running low and could not risk my livestock starving. I had no idea he was going to show up with a person he had bought from a desperate family. So what am I to you?" Frank asked, needing to hear him say it. "Am I a servant, a slave, something worse?" "You are a person who got dealt a terrible hand," Kade said firmly, meeting her eyes. "And you are under my roof, which means you are under my protection. That is all I know right now. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, we can figure out the rest. But tonight, you are safe here. I give you my word on that." Frank wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the sincerity she heard in his voice, but she had learned young that wanting something did not make it true. Still, she was too exhausted to argue, too grateful for the warmth and the apparent reprieve from immediate harm to question her good fortune too closely. She nodded, and Kade disappeared upstairs, returning a few minutes later with a heavy flannel shirt and a pair of wool pants with rope for a belt. "You can change in there," he said, pointing to a small room off the kitchen that appeared to be a washroom. "I will heat up some stew." Frank took the clothes and retreated to the washroom, closing the door and leaning against it for a moment, letting herself simply breathe. Her whole body ached from the cold, and her mind felt sluggish, unable to fully process everything that had happened in the last few hours. She changed mechanically, her fingers clumsy on the buttons, and found that Kade's clothes swallowed her frame but were infinitely warmer than her thin dress. When she emerged, he had set 2 bowls of stew on a rough wooden table and was ladling more from a pot hung over the fire. They ate in silence, and Frank could not remember anything ever tasting better than that simple meal of meat and vegetables and thick broth. She finished her bowl and found Kade refilling it without comment. She ate that too, slower this time, feeling warmth spreading through her body from the inside out. When she finally set down her spoon, she found him watching her with an expression she could not read. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You do not need to thank me for basic decency," Kade replied, standing to clear the bowls. "You can take my bed tonight. I will sleep down here." "I cannot take your bed," Frank protested. "You have already given me your coat, your clothes, your food. I can sleep down here just fine." "You have been through hell tonight," Kade said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You need proper rest in a proper bed. I will not hear another word about it." Frank was too tired to fight him. She let him lead her upstairs to a simply furnished bedroom with a large bed covered in quilts. He lit a lamp on the nightstand and turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "There is a bolt on the inside of the door," he said without looking at her. "Use it if it makes you feel safer." He left before she could respond, closing the door behind him. Frank stood in the middle of the room, staring at that closed door, at the bolt he had pointed out, understanding the gesture for what it was. He was giving her control, showing her she could protect herself from him if she needed to. Something tight in her chest loosened slightly, and she crossed to the door and threw the bolt, then collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. Sleep took her instantly, dragging her down into darkness. She woke to pale morning light filtering through a window and the sounds of someone moving around downstairs. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, then memory crashed back and she sat up abruptly, her heart racing. The storm had passed. She could see through the window that the world outside was buried under feet of snow, pristine white stretching as far as she could see, but the wind had died and the sky was clear. Frank climbed out of bed and went to the washroom, finding a basin of water waiting that was still slightly warm. She washed her face and hands, tried to do something with her tangled hair, and finally gave up and braided it simply. When she came downstairs, she found Kade at the stove, cooking eggs and bacon. "Morning," he said, glancing at her. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Frank admitted. "Thank you again for the bed." "I told you, no thanks necessary." He plated the food and brought it to the table, and they sat down to eat. Frank felt awkward in the morning light, unsure how to act or what to say. The desperation of the previous night had faded, leaving behind the uncomfortable reality of her situation. "I have been thinking," Kade said after a few minutes of silence, "about what we should do." Frank's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "And the way I see it, you have a few options," Kade said carefully. "First, I could take you back to your father when the road's clear, assuming that is what you want. Second, I could take you into town and see if anyone there needs help, maybe find you work and a place to stay. Third, you could stay here, at least for a while, until you figure out what you want to do next." "Stay here and do what?" Frank asked. "You said last night I was not a servant or a slave, but if I stay, I would need to earn my keep somehow. I would not take charity." "I could use help around the ranch," Kade said honestly. "The house needs proper keeping, and I have been managing alone since my father died last year. It is a lot of work for one person. If you stayed, I would pay you fair wages, and you would have your own space and your own freedom. You could leave whenever you wanted. No strings, no obligations beyond honest work." Frank studied him, searching for hidden motives or lies, but his face was open and sincere. "Why would you do that for me? You do not know anything about me." "I know you got traded by your father to a man like Dobbs, and you still asked if I would freeze when I gave you my coat," Kade said quietly. "I know you are scared but trying not to show it, and I know you deserve better than what happened to you. That is enough." Something in Frank's chest cracked open at his words, something that had been frozen solid for as long as she could remember. She blinked hard against the sudden sting of tears and looked away, not wanting him to see how much his simple kindness affected her. "I would like to stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least for a while. I do not want to go back to my father, and I do not know anyone in town, but I need you to understand something." "What is that?" "I will work hard and I will earn my keep, but I am not going to be anything else to you," Frank said, forcing herself to look at him directly. "I know what some men expect from women in my position, and I need to know right now if that is going to be a problem." Kade's expression darkened, and for a moment she saw real anger flash in his eyes, though she sensed it was not directed at her. "That will never be a problem," he said, his voice hard. "I do not want anything from you except honest work and maybe, eventually, friendship if we can manage it. What happened to you last night was wrong on every level, and I will not compound that wrong by treating you as anything less than a person deserving respect. You have my word on that, for whatever it is worth." Frank let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Then I will stay and work for you, and we will see how it goes." They shook hands across the table, and Frank felt the callous strength of his palm against hers, the firm grip that sealed their agreement. It was not much, just a handshake and a promise, but it was more than she had woken up with yesterday, and she would build on it whatever she could. The next few days fell into a routine that surprised Frank with its comfortable simplicity. Cade showed her around the ranch, explaining what needed to be done and when. He raised cattle primarily, with a small herd of horses and some chickens for eggs. The storm had done some damage to the barn roof, and they spent hours together repairing it, working side by side in the cold. Frank had grown up on a homestead and knew hard work, knew how to handle tools and livestock, and she could see Cade's surprise and approval when she proved capable and competent. They talked while they worked, cautious conversations at first, feeling each other out. Frank learned that Cade had inherited the ranch from his father, who had built it from nothing over 20 years. His mother had died giving birth to a stillborn daughter when Cade was 15, and it had just been him and his father after that, until the older man's heart gave out the previous winter. Cade had been running the place alone since then, and Frank could see the toll it had taken in the lines around his eyes, and the way he sometimes moved like he was carrying weight on his shoulders that never fully lifted. "Did you never think about marrying?" Frank asked one afternoon as they mucked out stalls. Having a family to help with the work, Cade was quiet for a long moment, his shovel scraping against the floor. "I thought about it," he finally said, "but the kind of marriage I saw growing up was not something I wanted to repeat. My father loved my mother, but she died anyway, and it broke something in him. I watched him grieve for years, barely living. I was not sure I wanted to risk that kind of pain." "And now?" Frank asked, then immediately wished she had not. It was too personal, too close to something she did not want to examine. "Now I am not sure what I want," Cade said, glancing at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Except to make it through each day and do right by the people and animals depending on me." Frank nodded and changed the subject, but the conversation stayed with her, circling in her mind during the quiet moments. She found herself watching Cade when he did not know she was looking, noticing small things about him. The way he was gentle with the animals, his voice low and soothing when a horse was skittish. The way he always made sure she ate before he did, always gave her the better portion. The way he smiled, rare but genuine, when something pleased him. He was nothing like her father or the other men she had known growing up, men who were hard and bitter from frontier life. Cade had a core of decency that seemed unshakable, and Frank found herself drawn to it in ways that confused and frightened her. A week after the storm, Frank was in the house preparing dinner when she heard a horse approaching. She looked out the window and saw a rider, a tall man in a sheriff's badge. Cade came out of the barn and greeted him, and they talked for several minutes before both men turned to look at the house. Frank's heart began to race. Had her father reported her missing? Was she going to be forced to go back? She moved away from the window and tried to focus on the stew she was stirring, but her hands shook. The door opened and Cade came in, followed by the sheriff, a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He looked Frank over carefully, and she forced herself to stand straight and meet his gaze. "This is Sheriff Dalton," Cade said. "He has been making the rounds, checking on folks after the storm. I told him about your situation." "Did you now?" Frank said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Had to," Cade replied. "It is the right thing to do, make sure everything is legal and proper." "Miss Turner," the sheriff said, his voice surprisingly kind. "Cade here tells me your father traded you to a supply merchant named of Dobbs, and Cade ended up with you as part of a deal he did not agree to. That about right?" "Yes, sir," Frank said quietly. "And Cade's been treating you proper." "You are here of your own will?" "Yes, sir," Frank repeated, more firmly this time. "Mr. Zimmerman has been nothing but respectful and kind. I am working for him for wages and I am free to leave whenever I choose. That true, Kade? The sheriff asked, though his tone suggested he already believed it. It is, Kade confirmed. I am paying her fair wages and she has her own space. She is an employee, nothing more, and she stays or goes as she pleases. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then I suppose there is no law being broken here, long as that remains the case. As for your father, Miss Turner, I will be paying him a visit to explain that what he did was morally bankrupt, even if it was not quite illegal, him being your father and you being of age. Dobbs has already left the territory, probably figured he would do that before someone strung him up. But if you want to press charges of some kind, I can look into options. Frank thought about that, about dragging everything into the open, about the shame and the gossip and her siblings who were probably only alive because of the supplies Dobbs had provided. She shook her head. I just want to move forward, she said. What is done is done. Fair enough, Sheriff Dalton said. He looked between her and Kade one more time, then nodded as if satisfied. I will check in again in a few weeks, just to make sure everything stays above board. No offense meant, Kade, but I have to look out for folks, especially young women in vulnerable positions. No offense taken, Kade said. I appreciate you doing your job, Sheriff. Would you like to stay for dinner? We have plenty. The sheriff declined, saying he had more stops to make before dark, and rode off a few minutes later. Frank watched him go, feeling both relieved and strangely exposed. Having the law know about her situation made it more real somehow, less like a temporary dream she might wake from. Are you angry I told him? Kade asked quietly. No, Frank said after considering. You were right. It needed to be done properly. She turned back to the stove, stirring the stew with more force than necessary. Did you mean what you said, that I could leave whenever I choose? Every word, Kade said. I will not lie to you, Frank, not ever. She believed him. That was the strange thing. After everything she had been through, all the reasons she had to mistrust men and doubt promises, she believed Kade Zimmerman when he said he would not lie to her. She ladled stew into bowls and they ate together at the table that was becoming familiar, and Frank felt something shift inside her, some small movement toward trust. The weeks passed, winter gradually loosening its grip on the land. Frank settled into the rhythm of ranch life, finding satisfaction in work well done, and the quiet companionship she was building with Kade. They developed an easy partnership, able to work together without much need for words, each learning to anticipate what the other needed. Frank cooked meals that filled the house with warmth and good smells, and she could see Kade putting on healthy weight, the gauntness leaving his face. She took pride in that, in the visible evidence that her presence made a positive difference. But alongside the satisfaction came something more complicated, something she tried repeatedly to ignore. She had started noticing the way Kade's shirt pulled across his shoulders when he lifted heavy feed sacks. The sound of his laugh when one of the horses did something ridiculous. The careful way he would touch her elbow to guide her around an icy patch, his hand steady and warm. She found herself looking for excuses to be near him, and then scolding herself for being foolish. He had given her safety and employment and respect. She had no right to want more than that, and more importantly, she had no reason to think he saw her as anything except what he had said, an employee and maybe a friend. One evening in early March, they were sitting by the fire after dinner, Frank mending one of Kade's shirts while he sharpened tools. The domestic scene felt almost surreal given how they had met, and Frank found herself thinking about the girl she had been just 2 months earlier, starving and desperate in her father's cabin. That person felt like a stranger now. You are quiet tonight, Kade observed, glancing up from the knife he was working on. "Just thinking," Frank replied. "About what?" "About how different everything is now," she said honestly. "About how strange it is that the worst night of my life led to this." "This?" Kade asked, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. "Being here. Being safe. Having enough to eat and work that matters." Frank set down the shirt and met his eyes. "Being around someone who treats me like I am worth something." Kade put down the knife and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. "You are worth something, Frank. You are worth more than your father understood, more than Dobbs could calculate. You are worth more than gold, and I need you to know that." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Frank was almost afraid to acknowledge. "Kade," she said softly, not sure what she was asking. "I know what I said when you first got here," Kade continued, his voice low and intense. "I know I promised there would be no expectations, no pressure. And that promise still stands, Frank. But I also need to be honest with you, because I said I would never lie, and keeping silent feels like a lie now." "Honest about what?" Frank asked, her heart hammering. "About the fact that somewhere along the way, you stopped being just an employee I was helping out," Kade said. "You became someone I look forward to seeing every morning. Someone who makes this house feel like a home instead of just a place I sleep. Someone I care about more than I probably should, given the circumstances." Frank stared at him, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to be cautious, to protect herself from potential hurt. But a larger part, the part that had been growing stronger every day she spent with Kade, wanted to take the risk, wanted to reach for something good even if it scared her. "I care about you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to keep things simple and safe, but I cannot help it." Kade stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling in front of her chair so they were eye to eye. "I do not want you to feel obligated to me because of the situation that brought you here," he said seriously. "I do not want you to think you owe me anything or that you need to return my feelings. What I want is for you to be happy and safe, even if that means just staying friends." "What if I want more than friendship?" Frank asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if I want to see where this could go?" "Then I would be the luckiest man in Texas," Kade said simply. Frank reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble. Kade held very still, letting her explore, his eyes dark and warm. She leaned forward slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and brushed her lips against his in a tentative kiss. Kade made a soft sound and kissed her back, gentle but definite, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. It was nothing like the rough, grabbing advances she had feared from men. It was sweet and questioning and respectful, everything Kade was, and Frank felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness of it. When they pulled apart, Kade rested his forehead against hers. "We can go as slow as you need," he murmured. "There is no rush, no pressure. I just want to be with you, whatever that looks like." "I want that too," Frank said, and realized she meant it completely. "I want to build something real with you, Kade. Something that is not about what happened before or how we met, but about who we choose to be now." "Then that is what we will do," Kade promised. They sat together by the fire for a long time after that, Frank leaning against Kade's chest while his arms wrapped around her, both of them simply existing in the quiet joy of having declared themselves. Frank had never felt safer or more valued in her entire life, and she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the strange path that had brought her to this moment. The next few months were the happiest Frank had ever known. She and Kade courted properly, walking the line between the growing intimacy of their feelings and the respect he insisted on showing her. He continued to sleep downstairs, saying he would not share her bed until they were properly married, if that was what she wanted. Frank appreciated his old-fashioned values, even as part of her wished he was less honorable. She had never wanted someone the way she wanted Cade, never felt this pull toward another person that was both physical and emotional, and something deeper she did not have words for. They worked together during the days and talked for hours in the evenings, learning each other's stories and dreams. Frank told him about her mother, about the woman's quiet strength, and the way she had made their harsh life bearable with small acts of beauty. Cade talked about his parents, about the love between them that had been real even if it ended in tragedy. And Frank began to understand why he had been hesitant to risk his heart. They were both carrying wounds from the past, but they were learning to trust that together they could build something stronger than their individual scars. In May, wildflowers carpeted the land in brilliant colors, and Cade took Frank riding to show her the far corners of the ranch. They stopped on a hill overlooking miles of rolling prairie, and Cade dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a flat section of ground. "This is where I have been thinking we could build a bigger house someday. There is a good view and the position would be easy to defend, not that we need much defending these days. I was thinking maybe 4 bedrooms, a big kitchen, a porch that wraps around the front." "4 bedrooms?" Frank asked, her breath catching. "1 for us, and maybe 3 for children," Cade said, watching her face carefully. "If that is something you want. I know we have not talked about it directly, but I want a future with you, Frank. I want marriage and children and growing old together. I want everything if you will have me." Frank felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Are you asking me to marry you, Kade Zimmerman?" "I am," he said, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "It was my mother's. My father gave it to me before he died and told me to give it to a woman worthy of it. I cannot think of anyone more worthy than you. Will you marry me, Frank? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how precious you are?" "Yes," Frank said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." Cade slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. He kissed her there on the hilltop with the wind blowing around them and the flowers dancing at their feet. And Frank felt like she had finally come home to a place she had been searching for her entire life without knowing it. They were married a month later in Brownsville, with Sheriff Dalton standing as a witness, and a small gathering of ranchers and townspeople who had come to know and respect them both. Frank wore a simple white dress that Cade had bought her from the general store, and she had never felt more beautiful. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Cade kissed her with a passion that had been building for months, drawing cheers and laughter from the assembled crowd. The wedding night was everything Frank had hoped and feared, a mixture of nervousness and desire that Cade navigated with patience and care. He took his time showing her the pleasures that existed between a man and woman who genuinely loved each other, and Frank discovered that her body was capable of joy she had never imagined. They made love in the bed that was now truly theirs, and afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Frank whispered against Cade's chest, "I never thought I could be this happy. I never thought happiness like this even existed." "It exists because we built it together," Cade murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Because we chose each other every day, even when it was hard or scary or uncertain. That is what makes this real." "I love you," Frank said, the words still new enough to feel momentous. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes." "I love you too," Cade replied. "And I promise I will spend every day earning that love and showing you mine." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Frank's last thought before drifting off was that she had finally found where she belonged. The seasons turned, and life settled into a rhythm that was both predictable and fulfilling. Frank and Kade worked the ranch together, expanding the herd and improving the property. They started building the house on the hill, doing much of the work themselves with help from neighbors during barn-raising style gatherings that turned into community celebrations. Frank discovered she had a talent for gardening and soon had vegetables and herbs flourishing behind the house. She also started raising chickens more extensively, selling eggs in town and saving the profits in a jar she kept in the kitchen. "What are you saving for?" Kade asked one evening, watching her count coins. "Our children's future," Frank said simply. "So they never have to make the choices my father made, so they always have options." Kade pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "They will have options," he promised. "We will make sure of that together." In the autumn of their first year of marriage, Frank discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be certain before saying anything. When she finally told Kade, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then immediately set her down carefully as if she might break. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Frank said, amused by his sudden protectiveness. "I know, but I am going to take care of you anyway," Kade replied. "Both of you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Frank continued to work alongside Kade until her growing belly made certain tasks impractical. Kade fussed over her constantly, bringing her water and making her rest, until Frank had to finally tell him to stop hovering, or she would lose her mind. They argued about it briefly, their first real fight as a married couple, but made up quickly when Kade admitted he was just terrified of something going wrong. "I will not lose you like my father lost my mother," he said quietly. "I could not bear it." "You will not lose me," Frank promised, taking his hand and placing it on her belly where the baby was kicking. "I am strong and everything is going well. You have to trust that." "I trust you," Kade said. "I just wish I could control everything else." "You cannot," Frank said gently. "None of us can. We just have to have faith and do our best." Their son was born in early May, arriving with the spring flowers and a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. The labor was long and hard, attended by a midwife from town and lasting through the night, but Frank came through it exhausted but healthy. Kade was there for all of it, holding her hand and wiping her face with cool cloths, refusing to leave even when the midwife suggested he might be more comfortable elsewhere. When the baby was finally placed in Frank's arms, cleaned and wrapped in a soft blanket, she looked up at Kade and saw tears streaming down his face. "We have a son," she whispered, awed by the tiny perfect creature she held. "We have a son," Kade repeated, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant's fingers curled around his father's finger and Kade made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He is perfect. You are perfect. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for this gift." They named him Kieran, meaning little dark one for the shock of black hair he had been born with, and he became the center of their universe. Frank had worried she might not know how to be a good mother, given her own childhood, but she discovered that love made up for a lot of uncertainty. She and Kade navigated parenthood together, learning as they went, supporting each other through the exhaustion and fear and overwhelming tenderness that came with caring for a new life. Kieran was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Grace, for the gift she represented, and then 3 years after that by another son they called Matthew. The house on the hill was finished by then, large and comfortable, with room for their growing family and the life they were building together. Frank's vegetable garden had expanded into a small farm operation, and Kade's herd had grown enough that they were prospering beyond what either had dreamed. One evening, when the children were finally asleep after much protest, Frank and Kade sat on their porch watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs. Frank was 42 now, Kade 46, both of them marked by time and work but content in ways they had never expected to be. "Do you ever think about that night?" Frank asked quietly. "The blizzard?" "Sometimes," Kade admitted. "I think about how close I came to refusing to take you, to leaving you with Dobbs or sending you back to your father. It terrifies me how easily I could have made a different choice." "But you did not," Frank said, reaching for his hand. "You brought me here and you treated me with respect when you had no reason to, and you built a life with me. That is what matters." "Do you ever regret it?" Kade asked. "I know you did not choose how you came to be here." "I know you were given no say in that part." Frank considered the question seriously. She thought about her father, whom she had seen only once more over the years, a brief, awkward encounter in Brownsville where he had tried to apologize, and she had told him she forgave him but wanted nothing more to do with him. She thought about her siblings, two of whom had written to her over the years with tentative letters seeking connection. She thought about all the paths her life could have taken, all the what-ifs and might-have-beens. "No," she finally said, "I do not regret it. I regret the circumstances and the choices that led to it, and I regret that my father thought selling me was his only option. But I do not regret ending up here with you. You gave me a life I could not have imagined, Kade. You gave me love and respect and partnership and a family. You showed me that I was worth more than I had been taught to believe. How could I ever regret that? You gave me just as much," Kade said, pulling her close. "More, maybe. You took a lonely ranch house and turned it into a home. You took a man who was afraid to love and showed him it was worth the risk. You gave me 3 beautiful children and 20 years of happiness I would not trade for anything." 25 years, Frank corrected with a smile. "It has been 25 years since that blizzard, Kade." "A quarter of a century." 25 years, Kade repeated, shaking his head in wonder. "Where did the time go?" "Into building this," Frank said, gesturing at the house behind them, the barn and outbuildings, the land stretching in all directions. "Into raising our children and growing old together. Into becoming the people we are now." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue, stars beginning to emerge. From inside the house, they heard one of the children call out in sleep, and Frank started to rise, but Kade gently pushed her back down. "I will check," he said. "You rest." Frank watched him go inside, this man who had become her entire world, and felt a rush of love so intense it nearly took her breath away. They had not had an easy life, not really. There had been hard winters and dry summers, cattle disease and difficult births, injuries and illnesses, and all the challenges that came with frontier existence. They had lost Kade's favorite horse to a snake bite and Frank's first vegetable crop to an early frost. They had argued and disagreed and struggled to understand each other during the times when understanding seemed impossible. But through all of it, they had held on to each other and the commitment they had made, the choice to build something lasting. Kade returned a few minutes later, reporting that Matthew had been having a bad dream but was settled now. He sat back down beside Frank and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side the way she had for 25 years. "Do you think the children understand how lucky they are?" Frank asked. "To be growing up with 2 parents who love each other and them." "I think they will someday," Kade said, "when they are older and have seen more of the world. Right now they just think this is normal, which I suppose is how it should be. Normal is all any child should have to expect." "I want them to know their worth," Frank said intensely. "I want them to understand that they have value beyond what they can produce or provide. I want them to never doubt that they are loved. They will know," Cade promised. Because we show them every day. Because we are giving them what we did not have, and that matters. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges and joys. Kieran grew into a tall, serious young man who loved the ranch and planned to take it over someday. Grace was creative and spirited, constantly drawing or writing stories, talking about going east to school. Matthew was the charmer, quick with a smile and a joke, good with the horses in ways that suggested he might become a trainer. Frank and Kade watched their children grow with pride and occasional terror, knowing they had to let them make their own choices and their own mistakes. When Kieran announced at 23 that he wanted to marry a girl from town, a sweet-faced young woman named Catherine who worked at the general store, Frank felt the poignancy of time passing. She helped Catherine plan the wedding, which was held at the ranch with half of Brownsville attending, and she cried as she watched her son exchange vows. Kade squeezed her hand during the ceremony, and when she looked at him, she saw his eyes were wet too. "When did we get old enough to be watching our children marry?" he whispered. "Gradually," Frank whispered back, and then all at once. Grace left for school in Boston the following year, and the house felt too quiet without her vibrant presence. Frank worried constantly, despite Grace's regular letters assuring them she was fine and loving her studies. Matthew, at 18, announced he wanted to travel west and work on different ranches before deciding what to do with his life. And though it broke her heart, Frank helped him pack and gave him her blessing. "They are all leaving," she said to Kade one night after Matthew had ridden away, his bedroll tied behind his saddle. "The house is going to be so empty." "Kieran and Catherine are building a place just over the East Ridge," Kade reminded her. "They will be close, and we will have grandchildren to spoil soon enough. Grace will come home for visits. Matthew will be back once he gets wandering out of his system. This is not an ending, Frank. It is just a new chapter." He was right, of course. Kieran and Catherine's first child, a daughter, was born the next spring, and Frank discovered that being a grandmother was its own kind of joy. Grace returned from Boston with a degree and a young professor she had fallen in love with, a kind man who won Kade's approval by asking properly for her hand. Matthew came home after 2 years of traveling, full of stories, and ready to start a horse breeding operation with his father's help. The ranch evolved to accommodate the growing family, with new houses built and new ventures started. Frank found herself at the center of a clan that had grown from just her and Kade to include children and their spouses, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. They held Sunday dinners that filled the big house with noise and laughter. 3 generations gathered around tables loaded with food. On their 40th anniversary, the family threw Frank and Kade a celebration that brought people from all over the county. There were speeches and toasts and music and dancing, and at the end of the night, Frank and Kade slipped away from the party to walk alone under the stars, holding hands like young lovers. 40 years, Frank marveled. How did we make it 40 years? By choosing each other every day, Kade said, the same answer he had given so many times before. By remembering what matters. "You know what I remember most clearly from that first night?" Frank asked. "It is not the cold or the fear or the uncertainty. It is the moment you said I was worth more than gold. Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. Nobody had ever made me feel valuable just for existing." "You are valuable," Kade said firmly, stopping to face her. "You are the most valuable thing in my life, Frank. You always have been. From that first moment I saw you standing in the snow, I knew you were someone special. I just had to convince you of it." "You spent 40 years doing that," Frank said with a smile. "I think I am finally convinced." "Good," Kade replied, pulling her close. Because I plan to spend however many years we have left continuing to prove it." They swayed together there in the starlight. No music, except the wind and the distant sounds of celebration from the house. Frank closed her eyes and let herself feel everything: the ache in her aging body and the fullness in her heart, the weight of years lived fully and the lightness of love sustained. This was what she had built from that terrible night 40 years ago, this abundance of connection and meaning. She had been traded for supplies in a blizzard, valued at less than sacks of grain and medicine. But the cowboy who had taken her in had seen something different, had said she was worth more than gold, and then spent a lifetime proving those words true. The years slowed but did not stop. Frank and Kade watched their grandchildren marry and have children of their own. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, and the small daily victories that made up a well-lived life. They mourned losses too, friends passing and eventually their own children showing signs of age. Grace lost her husband to a sudden illness, and Frank held her daughter while she grieved, offering what comfort she could from her own reservoir of hard-won wisdom. Kieran developed a limp from an old injury, and Matthew's hair went white early, just like Kade's had. When Frank was 72 and Kade 76, they decided to retire from active ranch work, turning the daily operations over to Kieran and his sons. They moved to a small cottage built near the original ranch house, a simple 2-room structure that was perfect for their needs. Frank kept a small garden and Kade still worked with the horses when he felt up to it, but mostly they just existed together. Two old people who had found each other in a storm and never let go. One evening in late autumn, 50 years after the blizzard that had changed everything, they sat on their cottage porch wrapped in blankets against the chill. Kade's health had been declining, his heart not as strong as it once was, and they both knew without discussing it that their time was growing short. But there was no fear in that knowledge, just a quiet acceptance. "You remember," Frank said softly, "how scared I was that first night. How certain I was that my life was over." "I remember," Kade said, his voice thinner than it used to be but still steady. "I remember thinking I had no idea what to do with you, how to help you. You figured it out," Frank said, reaching for his hand. "You saved me, Kade." "In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Kade corrected. "I was half dead when you arrived, Frank, just going through motions. You gave me a reason to live again. You gave me everything." 50 years, Frank marveled. Half a century of marriage. 3 children, 11 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren so far. A ranch that will sustain the family for generations. "We did well, did we not?" "We did better than well," Kade said. "We did magnificently." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Frank felt a deep sense of peace settling over her, a contentment that came from knowing she had lived fully and loved completely. Whatever happened now, whatever time they had left, she had no regrets. The girl who had been traded for supplies was long gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and had built a legacy that would outlast her body. Kade squeezed her hand, and she looked over to find him watching her with the same love she had seen in his eyes for 50 years. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since you asked if I would freeze when I gave you my coat. I will love you past the end of time." "I love you too," Frank said, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you for seeing me when I could not see myself. Thank you for building this life with me." "It was my greatest honor," Kade replied. They watched the sun disappear below the horizon, the first stars emerging in the darkening sky. Behind them, lights glowed in the big house where Kieran's family was gathering for dinner, voices and laughter drifting on the evening air. The ranch was alive and thriving, a testament to what two people could create when they chose love over fear, partnership over isolation, hope over despair. Frank leaned her head on Kade's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat together as the night descended. Two souls who had found each other in a blizzard and built something that would warm generations to come. The cowboy had said she was worth more than gold, and then spent 50 years proving it in every action and every word. In turn, Frank had given him her heart and her trust and her days, building with him a love story that had started in the darkest moment and grown into something luminous. As the stars wheeled overhead and the world settled into sleep, Frank closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, she had lived a life rich beyond measure. She had been traded for supplies in a blizzard, but she had been claimed by love, and that had made all the difference. Kade passed quietly in his sleep 3 months later, his hand still holding Frank's, his last breath a peaceful sigh. Frank grieved him deeply but without regret, knowing they had been given more time than most couples dreamed of, and had used it well. She lived another 2 years, surrounded by family, telling stories of the ranch's early days and the man who had changed everything. When she finally followed Kade into whatever came next, she went peacefully, a smile on her face, her last thoughts of that first kiss by the fire and all the kisses that had followed. They were buried side by side on the hill where Kade had proposed, where they had planned the house that became the heart of their family. Their grandchildren erected a simple stone marker with their names and dates and a single line beneath, worth more than gold. The ranch continued to thrive under Kieran's leadership, and would pass eventually to his children and theirs, each generation adding to the legacy of those who had built it. And on winter nights when the wind howled and snow fell heavy, the family would gather by the fire and tell the story of how it all began, with a blizzard and a trade and a cowboy who saw worth where others saw only a transaction. It became the family mythology, the foundation story that reminded them where they came from and what mattered most. Love, they would say, passing the story down to children and grandchildren. Love was always worth more than gold. Love was what built everything that endured. And Frank and Kade had loved exceptionally well.